Welcome to the episode 1 of the Wrestling Prep Podcast. We're here with head coach Carolyn Wester and one of her athletes, Drew Morgan. He's a resident athlete at the U.S. Naval Academy, their RTC there. And I met Carolyn and Drew on the same day. So this is over 10 years ago, back in 2013. I had just become head coach of a high school team out in Arizona and was looking for a place to take a few of our athletes over the summer. And as many of you who are our coaches recognize, that the typical choice in the summer is to find a camp put on by an athlete who was successful. They'll teach you a little bit about what made them successful, which may or may not be applicable to your athletes. But I saw some videos of Carolyn working with a bunch of high school age kids, and I saw she was doing something different as far as not just accumulating wrestling techniques, but actually teaching wrestlers how to move and how to be more effective with the technique that they already knew. And so we hopped in a van, drove 6 wrestlers and one of my best friends, another coach, out, and showed up at a warehouse out in San Jose with a bunch of kids running around doing all kinds of awesome things, and spent a week out there. And Drew, I think you were probably a junior in high school at that point, right? I remember you had either placed or come pretty close to placing in state there in California, which I know is tough because I grew up there as well, much earlier than you did. And so yeah, that was it's cool to see everyone back together 10 years later, still doing the thing. So yeah, we'll start off. Carolyn, I know today you wanted to talk a little bit about how wrestlers or how athletes typically learn technique, and how oftentimes it starts with most coaches with a visual reference of what the technique looks like, and then tries to build from there. But you typically start somewhere else. So tell us about that process and how that works for you, maybe differently from what a typical coach how a typical coach might approach it.
Yes. So the average person, when they want to learn something in wrestling, they watch somebody execute a piece of technique, and then they're asked to mimic it, regardless of age or body type or awareness, self-awareness of how to use their muscle. And the approach that I take is that if you can teach an athlete how to use their body correctly, then their ability to assimilate technique and execute it is much better. And it's actually a barrier to success to not be able to shut your mind off and concentrate on how you're using your body over a mental image you've developed in your head. And the reason I feel this is multi-leveled, but when the brain processes information, the emotional response, the emotional center of the brain is stimulated first. And if the brain has a picture of something that it cannot conceive of doing, it will spike fear. And then you see the athlete shut down and they become fearful. And it takes a long time to get the logic side of their brain to kick in on this particular topic and be able to execute technique.
Okay. And Drew, did you want to talk about that as an athlete, as far as your learning of various techniques, and how this approach is different, and how perhaps it was helpful in that regard?
Definitely, yeah. From an athlete's perspective, like you said, I started working with Carolyn back in 2013, summer going into my junior year, and like you said, I was a decent wrestler for California. I think at that point I hadn't even qualified for the state tournament yet, which just qualifying for the state tournament is tough in California, but hadn't quite reached that yet. So I knew I was good, but I wasn't at that level. And I only spent 1 week that initial summer training with her. But to me, a lot of it just clicked right away by the way she would show the muscle sequence and the order, and then why it was helpful and was more efficient. And for me, it kind of just clicked in my head always of like, oh, that's more efficient. So I'm going to go with that. Why do all this work, picking someone up just to put them back down on the mat when I can just run through them, in a straight line, a lot of that kind of stuff. So as the more I worked with Carolyn, and got acclimated more to the muscle sequencing and doing it the right way in the, like I said, in the correct sequence. Um, because I wasn't around her year round, at that point I was living in Southern California. Her facility was up in San Jose, California, so 6-hour drive. I'd be lucky if I was up there, for Thanksgiving or whenever we got break off of school. Um, so to me, I wasn't doing it year round with her. So a lot of times she explained, hey, do this. And like she said, that emotional side starts to kick in of, oh, I don't think I can, because you're trying to understand it in your head and build this image of, the back handspring split shoot, or back flip split shoot, these big kind of concepts or movements, and you almost pull yourself the throttle back because in your head you've built up this, I don't know if I can do it. When really, as I got older and was around her more and really started to trust her and trust the math and the sequence, when you let go of that fear and you say, well, I'm going to full throttle it and follow the muscle order because I've drilled it and done it so many times, those were the times when it would come right away, almost instantly. We always look at each other like big-eyed, like, yeah, you just did that. You finally let it go. And I think once I started realizing that is when I started making the bigger gains and really started to improve, especially at the collegiate level. When I wasn't around her as much, only over the summers for a few weeks at a time, I was able to make so much ground because I just sort of released myself in those, like, the fear. I released the fear that I was building up and just trusted her, trusted the muscle sequence. And that's when I really saw myself starting to make gains, specifically in my wrestling, but a lot of time just in my muscle efficiency and in like my wattage, my output, my torque. I just became much more efficient wrestler.
Yeah, and what I try to instill in people, I'm in New York this week at a Renzo Gracie Jiu-Jitsu facility, is to let go of what you conceive and let's put these muscles in order. So what Drew is describing originally about efficiency and this is easier, why go down on my knee and come up when I can go through and my trajectory and my wattage would be more effective. That is something we initially start with so we can develop some belief, therefore trust from the athlete. If it's a lot of times when I'm working with jiu-jitsu people, they trust me right away because they don't know anything about wrestling. And they just will activate the muscle in the order I suggest. And they can't conceive of what it's going to look like anyway, because they're not familiar. They just will do it more effectively. And in actuality, what's even more important is that when an athlete goes out on the mat, being in the most efficient body position because they're actively saying to themselves, they're walking out, they're going to shake their opponent's hands, like I'm retracting my calves, pulling my transfers, ab back, my body's parallel to the mat, I'm changing levels with my trail leg. They are now set up to execute any and all of their shots and also be defensive if that were to be required. But they're not thinking, okay, I'm going to low single, maybe do an Iranian. If they grab me, I'm going to, pass them by. Those kinds of mental cues do not present the body and the mind with the ability to build the structure. You are not taught when you shoot or when you pass somebody by or slide by, whatever you're doing, you're not taught, okay, the slide by requires 14 sets of sequential muscle order and it begins here and it goes through this. If you made a flashcard and said slide by, and on the other side you wrote all the muscle order and you trained the athlete's mind over and over, separate from a practice or even in a practice, what that entails, then that would be great. You could call out the name of the move and they would be able to process down. But that's not really the case, especially with male athletes in high school. I mean, they can't even, their insurance rates for driving a car are so much higher than a female's, right? They don't make that naturally. But if I teach an athlete or an athlete gets taught by the muscle order to put themselves in a position, a specific position, and then you teach them all the technique that they're able to do from that position, then the athlete themselves are able to execute without having to try to process terms that don't have muscle order definition to it. And it becomes more effective and easier. And subsequently, it allows an athlete to fire off years of knowledge because they have already assimilated themselves. When I'm in this position, here's the technique I know I can do. As opposed to going, what is this situation I'm in? What's going to happen? What pieces of technique I'm going to do? And the last thing they're thinking about is, am I in the right body position to even do it? But in actuality, that should be first, right?
Right.
I mean, you're like, so it's just almost like in anything. It's almost like in anything. I'm really hungry. I'd like to go to the grocery store. I want this blood orange cake from Trader Joe's. And you get in the car and you drive and you go, whoops, I didn't look, Trader Joe's isn't open. I don't have my wallet. It's the same thing, you know, are they open? Wallet first, go get what I need to get. And it's the same thing. And people, that's just not the way it's taught. And it's crippling to one, retention of athletes, youth athletes. It's crippling. If they are expected to understand, practice in a room with people who have more knowledge and feel good and successful, it's hard to retain. And two, it's not effective. You're minimalizing the number of options an athlete can utilize if they aren't taught from the get-go to be in a right position. You know, like just recently we spent a lot of time with Brando Lashavio, if I'm saying it correctly, who is a U.S. Olympian diver. There's no way they would have him practicing off the 10-meter board if his body wasn't in the exact right position before he took off, because he could kill himself instantly, right?
Right.
And even though we're not going to die instantly in wrestling, I believe if we had more focus on the muscle order in the teaching process, that we'd be a lot more successful at every level, and in jiu-jitsu and combat sports.
Yeah, a couple things stood out as both of you were describing this emphasis. One of them being the fear base, and I've seen this every time I've seen Carolyn. You work with a group of athletes. Typically, you'll have at least one or two athletes who have been with you for a while and are fairly proficient at the body leveraging, and then there'll be wrestlers who have never seen it in person before, walking in, sort of watching some of the some of the flips and some of the handsprings and things like that, and look at each other and think, I'll never be able to do that. That's crazy. And then by just watching and breaking down the muscle sequence and sort of taking them through it and easing that fear, they can then sort of shut off that part of their brain that would stop them from doing those things and just focus on the muscle sequence and the movement. And that puts them in a much better place as far as their ability to move their bodies, where they're thinking more along those lines rather than all of the things that they can't do.
Correct. I agree with that.
And then oh yeah, keep going.
You keep going.
Well, I was also thinking as a couple of things as Drew was talking about his technique and how it changed as he began to learn the body leveraging. One, and Carolyn, as you were saying too, looking at this from sort of oftentimes as wrestling coaches, we just pile on a whole bunch of technique. Well, if you get in this situation, here's a sequence of moves that you need to do in order to get out of that situation, rather than, and I'm a science teacher, so I think about things as sort of principle based as well. But if we can peel things back into, here's a good body position, here are the best ways to move from that body position, then as you said, it eliminates the overwhelming wave of techniques that must be hitting a wrestler's brain every time they get into a situation, because they don't necessarily have to think about the names of 18 moves that they might be able to execute. They just need to move their body in a way that preserves that structure that they've built. And maybe Drew, you can talk a little bit about how learning the muscle sequencing, and you've mentioned this as well, changed the way you approached a match throughout your career as you learned these things. Whereas, and yeah, talk about that as far as you mentioned, maybe being able to take some shortcuts in the techniques that you had previously been taught, because you were sort of working around ways that you weren't able to move your body before. Whereas by executing technique using some of the muscle sequencing that Carolyn was able to work with you, it seems like you might have been able to do things more effectively.
Yeah, definitely. What I took away as you were speaking was, for me, um, putting myself in the correct math-based position, especially the 90-degree angles. And I know Carolyn speaks about this a lot, is I just always felt safe no matter what position I was in, because a lot of the time I always knew I could return back. To me, at least, I always call it just home base. But for me, being in a 90-degree angle position, body position, whether that's with both of my knees down, whether that's in my stance, whether that's, we're more upright in, per se, an upper body type position. I always knew if I dropped down into 90 degrees, I was safe, and not even necessarily safe, but I knew how to move from that position. So, um, for me, like being able to wide leg, is wrestling prep terminology that maybe not everyone knows, but for me, I always knew if I'm on my hands and knees, kind of your stereotypical ref position for wrestling, and I'm in the wrestling prep muscle sequence of 90-degree angles, I could wide leg and be safe no matter what my opponent did trying to get around me, usually in the form of a circle. So for me, that position always, like I said, seemed the most efficient and effective. So I always knew if I could get to somewhere where I'm on both knees at 90 degrees, I could always react. And that's something that um, I think it's just my personality and the way I drilled with Carolyn stuff, as I always tried to be perfect doing it. And I would do a lot of reps, and I wanted to always like do it right, do it right. But a lot of time, especially in a match, adrenaline's going, speed, whatever. And she always joked about like, you're moving slower than you think in a match, just because anxiety or whatever, the person's moving. She can attest. Um, but it's just the idea of, move harder, faster, stronger through that position. So don't focus on just moving, because yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but as long as you're adhering to the concepts of math based and the sequential muscle order, it's going to be effective and you're going to be okay. And you can always return back to these said positions if needed. And I know that really helped me a lot. Like I said, especially as I progressed in college, like, I found that I just needed to be advanced or high level, whatever terminology you want to put on it, in those said positions. And once I really mastered those positions, I feel like that's when I really started to make bigger jumps in my career.
Right. So
And
rather than thinking about how to counter everything that your opponent is doing, you're instead thinking about what's a good position, and how do I get there, and how do I what's a position I know I'm stable in and that I can move well from. And you don't have to mentally go through the list of all of the different counters to whatever your opponent is doing. You can go back to a position
No,
you're good moving
exactly.
in
And I
and
think
wrestle well there.
definitely Carolyn explains it better too, so she can chime in right now. But she always explains how, she knows the numbers, but there's 3,600 or whatever possible scenarios that could happen out of these movements over a 6-minute match. Maybe Carolyn, you can chime in here. And like you said, there's no way your brain can compute all that fast. Whereas really, like for me, in the way I wrestle in my body shape and stuff, there's like 8 math-based positions that I'm most likely going to get in.
Mhm.
And then from there, it's really only 2 or 3 movements. It's wrestling terminology of, heel toe knee, second story pivot, reverse pivot, maybe, some of our terminology or vernacular,
over under
but that's all I need to know.
Right.
And
legs
so
in it.
for me, I look at it as like, that just simplifies it on my end.
Well, that's what I was going to say too, is that it's conversely the amount of information you have to have running through your head if you teach by sequential muscle order. So if, say, we take one of these 3 to 8 positions that Drew feels safe in that are math-based, and when he gets in them, and I am willing to answer all the questions anybody has about, well, wouldn't this negate that, or wouldn't this be, would push him over, or would this make this neutralized? And once you just are in one position and you have 8 or 12 different attempts, and they realize that, in fact, the math-based movement is going to hold them in place and give them that opportunity, then they let go. You can let go trying to stack in your brain every piece of information you've been taught since you got on the mat about what to do in any situation. So many of these people. So I have family members that are doctors, human doctors, right? And they're specialists, ER, cardiologist, dentist. They have a specialty, but I have 2 cousins that are veterinarians. So they're not learning one anatomical system
Right.
with one niche. They're learning 30 or 40 different species. And they have to walk around with this huge amount of knowledge. And oftentimes it's even ineffectual, because how much veterinary medicine focuses on lizards or turtles or ferrets or things that are very important when they're sick to the people that are paying the veterinarians their money. And they end up being ineffectual because they're not experts on each particular species. And it's almost the same. Once you've established what math-based body position you're effective in, then you can let go, because there'll be so many things you've learned or people threaten against you in terms of a technique that will no longer matter, because it will never be effective.
Okay, so if I'm a veterinarian, if I have an exotic pet, then I want a veterinarian that is an expert in general principles of anatomy and physiology, rather than one that has memorized a whole bunch of different animals and their body systems. And the same if I'm a wrestling coach or a wrestler, I'd much rather be a wrestler or be a coach that has someone that is an expert at sort of general principles of position and movement, rather than a wrestler that perhaps has been exposed to 50 different takedowns that they can execute at a sort of a mid-level. But if they're experts in movement and sort of general principles, then they can build upon that and use that as a base. Whereas, yeah, if we're building a pyramid, we want a large base, and then moving up to how we sort of funnel our opponent into positions that we want to wrestle them in, rather than knowing how to, a different way to move in every different situation, which, as Drew was saying earlier, if you're having to think of those things while you're wrestling, you're probably definitely moving a lot slower than you think you are in a match. Well, if all of those things are running through your head rather than just wrestling, right?
Yeah, well, and I think
That's for sure.
yeah, and I think what's important is that, so you have high school wrestlers, right? They go to the high school season, and the practice is maybe 2.5 hours, 30 minutes in and out, whether it's on the inside or the way out, is around general announcements, things that are going on, get your insurance form, whatever it may be. And then they do a warm up that usually is not based on technique. It's just what they've been doing through the years, or what the latest article somebody's read, and it's not warming them up for specific technique and specific body movement. In fact, if you ask somebody to explain how that helps in wrestling, they usually are like, well, I don't know if it does or not. It makes me more athletic. But any coach knows that athleticism comes second to good technique. So they do all these things. They have a whole high school season. They usually have a coach, maybe 2 or 3 in the room. We're trying to get new people, as you know, Bryce, trying to get new people started. And then they're trying to make the ones that are good a little bit better. And the ones that are better than everyone else usually end up having to teach everyone else.
Mhm.
So they go this whole time period of this school year. Maybe they go to an additional club, an ancillary club, 2 or 3 times a month. And then once they finish their high school season, with whatever results they get. They want to learn more in the summer and off season. And oftentimes there's this myth that the more accomplished in wrestling or in jujitsu, or the athlete is who's teaching, the better your child or your athlete's going to get. But what happens is they go to these camps and they're switching technique about every 10 minutes and they're drilling it maybe 6 to 8 times. They're not asking them to write it down and put it in a book and memorize it. And they often don't have their high school coach or a workout partner with them. And the truth of the matter is, there's movement that there's technique I've seen from great wrestlers that would take an average high school wrestler 3 or 4 years to learn how to do if somebody doesn't teach them by muscle order.
Mhm.
And then they finish the summer, the parents have invested thousands of dollars to fly around the country and go to what's considered the current in camps. And then they go back and have the same results. And then the focus becomes that the kid isn't working hard enough, or the high school coach isn't good enough, or the tournaments aren't the right tournaments, or you need different people in the room. But in reality, if they spent a week or 2 or 3 with somebody who was qualified to teach math-based movement, when they went to these other camps at other places, they'd be able to execute that technique, and they would retain it if they could execute it effectively. As soon as they execute something and they can't do it well, and there's someone they consider famous in front of them, or there's other people, they get nervous and shut down, and they feel hopeless. That's my experience.
I mean, that's how I take it too. And I think I have a very unique experience, working with Carolyn for so many years and working with her in high school before I went to college, and then working with her every summer, kind of like she said, able to pick up stuff. I was with her every summer for at least 2 to 4 weeks probably. And then, I had very high level coaching in college. I went to Campbell University. Kerry Colott was my head coach, who famous in the wrestling world for his technique. He was the first one that videoed it and archived it and kind of systematized it for everyone. Um, and it's, I would say, almost impossible to have the repertoire that he has of technique, in one person. Like, I've seen Kerry just hit stuff on the fly that you just be like, at 50 years old, he still can hit it pretty flawlessly. And you're like, whoa. And that's, credit to him for all the hours and years he spent on those moves. And he was very deliberate growing up to make sure he could hit such a wide variety of moves. Very rare to find someone like that. And so for me, I just think I had the unique perspective of watching him in practice demonstrate these moves, and I could pick up on the subtle kind of math-based movements he was doing that he didn't even know he did. He just did them instinctively because it's the most efficient way to wrestle. Like, the example I always use is the straight wrist, which wrestling prep people know.
Mhm.
I would watch him move people around, and he's always has a straight wrist when he's grabbing people. And and then for me, in my head, I could click that to, oh, that makes sense. I can boom, and then I could just boom, boom. Not to say I could repeat what he did, because we have very different body shapes and whatever, but it allowed me to pick up quicker what he showed in our college practices. And if not pick it up to where I could hit it, I could understand what he was doing and why either A, he was so effective at it, or why he's showing it. And I think that's kind of like what she said, is a lot of athletes could go to her for at least, 2-3 weeks. It's not like they got to be trained by her year round per se, especially if they live far across the country. She's traveling a lot, but it will at least help in understanding the basics of when people show these moves. They can understand the move, most likely pick it up quicker, or at least understand why they're not able to hit it effectively, because different body shapes, different, etc. Whatever you want to place in that, everyone's, I would say, more likely to hit specific techniques than other techniques, or at least gravitate toward them, so they can kind of understand why maybe that specific move's not for them. Instead of a coach yelling at them for not hitting it and why aren't you doing it my way, yada yada, you can say, well, that just doesn't work for me. in my body shape.
Well, and I had an interesting experience. You all both know Chrissy Creason. Chris Creason, he lived with me for, I don't know, till April, for 3 years, from May of 2020 till the end of May, around May 1 of 2023. And I coached him for years. Well, when I took him to the Navy, our club practices, Carrie got so excited. And he said, this Chris, to the whole group, is the first athlete I've ever seen do what I did naturally. And it was some specific math-based technique that Chrissy was hitting. And Carrie got so excited and pulled Chrissy in to show the group, because he goes, yeah, this is how I used to do it. I mean, he was thrilled.
Yeah.
And I, was not familiar with the piece of technique Carrie was demoing from Carrie's perspective, but and I don't even know if Chrissy and Carrie were doing the exact same thing, but the way Chrissy could use his body, Carrie knew Chrissy could do it. And that, I think is really, if you want your athlete to get high level, or even if you're just a hobbyist in something, learning how to build the structure of your body and use it across movement across the ground, it's a trajectory, and then learn technique either at the
Right.
same time or on top of that, is going to be way more effective.
Yeah, and that's interesting that Drew mentioned this whole lot there too, because I've had the experience as a coach where a wrestler who wants to get better, and this kind of circles back to the original point related to mimicking technique rather than learning to move your body. Where I'd have a wrestler, as Drew mentioned, Colot has probably the biggest catalog of technique available on video online. So I'd have a wrestler come in, show me a technique they had been working on, and I'd ask them where they learned it. Well, I saw, Colot do this in a video, and I'd say, well, show me the video that you're trying to mimic. And you watch them do it, and you watch Colot do it, and you see it's kind of the same thing, but you'd have to explain like what you're doing is not the same as what he's doing, especially when you wrestle them in that position, because they can be in the same position, but if they're not contracting their muscles in the right sequence and they're not building a good structure and moving well, it kind of looks like what they saw in the video, but it's not. And as Carolyn, as you're saying, if you learn, and Drew, it sounds like you were able to sort of backfill a lot of the technique that you saw with the position and movement that you knew from working with Carolyn, and then bridge that gap. Whereas if someone starts over here trying to learn high level technique without an understanding of muscle sequence and position, then they might be mimicking what they think they see in a video, but it's not going to be nearly as effective because they're not using their body in the same way that a Kerry Colot might be when he's executing the technique. I remember being at a clinic once where Henry Cejudo is here in Arizona, so I've been to a couple of clinics where he was teaching wrestlers, and I have other clinicians talk about his movement, and they say, I can't do that. Like when he's such an amazing athlete, they would talk about his technique that he was showing, and he said, well, that's amazing if you could do those things, but I can't do those things, and so we're going to try it this way. And it was interesting how and it all went back to the ability of both of those wrestlers, who were both successful, to move their body, and they were adapting their technique in ways to move that they could naturally move their body. Whereas if you start by increasing your bandwidth and your ability to hold position and move your body, then that opens up a whole bunch of technique that you wouldn't have been able to execute were you not to start there.
Mm-hmm. That's a very valid point. I mean, I think that's what we're trying to say. So Drew and I, like I said, are here in New York, working with predominantly jiu-jitsu athletes.
Mhm.
And the first thing I said to them was, you may have to accept that you're going to have to let go of a lot of previously conceived pieces of technique and knowledge that's stacked upon itself. And because you've spent time and money doing it, doesn't mean it's going to carry you through. Nothing is sadder, harder than to see an athlete who who can't break through from middle school to high school because their knowledge of technique is limited to snapping and circling or front headlock. That doesn't mean it is going to work in a lot of high school tournaments and matches, but is it going to carry them through to Division I, Division II, or Division III NCAA, tournaments? No, it's not. They could still hit those things, but they're going to need a much bigger repertoire, and they've missed years and years and years of learning how to use their body correctly and then how to be taught on top of it. And there have been many athletes who came to us who were not strong middle school wrestlers, not strong early year high school wrestlers. I would say Drew might actually be one of them, but by the time they'd gotten into college, they had learned enough math-based sequential body order and positioning that everything Mike Evans and Carrie and Scotty Sentes taught Drew, he was able to execute. And there's dozens of people that he wrestled in college that he would have, from California, that he would have not have beaten in high school, but beat them easily in college, in my opinion. He may have a different opinion, but I believe that's because he was able. There's a big difference between being able to be good at something because you know how to build the structure to be good at it, or you good at it because the only thing you did over and over and over, and it just might not be the right fit. 4 years in venture capital in Silicon Valley, there was a belief if it was a Java Beans or Java Plus, that the technology that was being built would never last. And now, of course, there's a completely different set of languages and a different set of languages. And when I entered venture capital, the rise and fall of the leading piece of developers' tools and code, it rotated about every 3 months. And in wrestling, if your body position is great, is correct, you're going to outlive, like right now it's a claw series, or I'm not right, or it's this, or it's this, or it's this, and they come and go. And someone could be the best at it at high school and try it in college, and it just won't work for them. Or they might be the best local jiu-jitsu practitioner, combatant, but not winning ADCC or any of the other major national events.
Yeah, so some technique goes viral because of someone hits it at NCAAs, and then everyone needs to learn that thing rather than going back to building their. But everyone's probably learning his Play-Doh now, right? Because of the recent viral video from NCAAs this last year. All right, I know we did want to keep these on the shorter side, and so any last words on this topic from either Drew or Carolyn before we wrap up?
Not at all. I think we kind of hit it on the head, at least for this topic. Kind of to me, the big takeaway is just how much focusing on the sequential muscle order and just being math-based can help expedite all technique. Not to say you got to work with Carolyn kind of specifically, since this is she's I would say the first of her kind teaching in this way. It's not to say you have to be coached by her year round, but if at least taking these principles and trying to incorporate it will, help you exponentially in all the other aspects where you try to expand your game and add technique, whether it's competitive wrestling, Division I international, or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you're just a hobbyist looking to get better every day. I think really can expand your game.
In the micro transitions, I would say the micro transitions in MMA, or the micro transitions from defense to offense in wrestling, and the micro transitions in jiu-jitsu, that being in a math-based position and knowing how to put your body in the next math-based position instead of falling to it or leaning or not having a solid structure or you feel uncomfortable, so you won't take the shot. You won't be aggressive when you need to be offensive. You won't unleash, a jab after an overhand right, whatever the situation is going to be eliminated when somebody understands and can utilize, body leveraging in math-based position.
All right. So yeah, if these things interest you, definitely check out Wrestling Prep. Wrestlingprep.com is the website. And we'll be back in the future if you want to hear a little more from a accomplished coach and athlete about the way they approach wrestling and coaching. We'll have more conversations like this in the future. But bye for now.
Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you, Bryce.